number of hands I'm seeing here, my job is, I believe, to assess whether or not it's better to not make the announcement because I believe that it really is as close to private as it can, or any evidence whatsoever that it is known outside of a small circle. And once I have any indication that it's known outside of a small circle, I believe it is my responsibility, and I've had customers tell me this because they want to have as much information as they can to do their own individual risk assessments, to go out with whatever information I have immediately, including possible potential workarounds, even if the workaround is unplug your box or grab your ankles.
Or just a candid ups. Derek, the other thing you can say is, to the best of our knowledge, there is no workaround at this time that we are aware. And part of what that sometimes does is actually generates interest in the community that says, hey, I'm creatively going to come up with an answer. That's just fine. But you're absolutely right. You end up assessing that position, and then at that moment you conclude whether or not you just got to go out and say, look, now we believe it's actually placed enough highlight into that topic that we've got to let you know.
So the vendors seem to be leaving it around judgment as to how serious is the threat. Sir, did you finish your comments?
Sort of. I just kind of wanted to get, panelists' opinion on and maybe the conversation moved that way towards, quantitatively evaluating vulnerabilities and getting sort of a threat rating and whatnot. Maybe, we'll get there. One point I wanted to bring up also that you seem to be talking about was when you're talking about, okay, we set a goal, but maybe not having a full workaround yet. And that's part of the reason why you're doing that, right, is to enlist the aid of, countless other people in the open source world and whatnot that will hopefully do the right thing, because there's plenty of people who do wrong.
Yeah, I think we would agree there's no such thing as limited disclosure.
Yeah, speaking from the vendor side, I think it's been demonstrated in recent history that when large vendors do things that have the word security associated with them, a lot of people listen. And I'll just use last summer as an example. And it's that amplification factor, positively or negatively, which in many respects actually worries us, which is we can create undue attention onto something that can hurt our customers unintentionally by something like disclosure. So it's an incredibly hard line, and believe me, philosophically, we debate it probably more than just about any other topic. But I think there's a fair expectation to suggest that says that in the best of most scenarios, and certainly I think from anybody that's on the vendor side in this panel, our hope, if you will, where our hearts lie, is the idea that says that if we know to the best of our knowledge, and that can be flawed, and you can hold us accountable if we're wrong, but if we know to the best of our knowledge that there is a weakness in a product and that we can't come up with a way to fix it yet, or it's in process, that we are attempting not to put you further at risk by drawing attention to it, by putting our name associated with the problem at large. That's the basic premise. Again, I think you have the right to know exactly where each one of your vendors stands in each one of those topics.
The guy at the back with the hat.
Thank you. Two pieces. One is there should be some type of acknowledgement. If you know the vulnerability, you should maybe not say exactly what it is, but you say, yeah, we have acknowledgement, and this is the potential risk in this, and not disclose it all. Whether that's 2 weeks into it and say we're going to have a plan in 3 weeks to address it. That lets the community know that you guys are on top of it. Because the underground are exploiting those pieces. It's just not one person doing it. One person, one researcher knows about it, it's the underground that's exploiting it back in. That's what the fear is when you're talking about major companies and protection of that. So from my angle, the full disclosure point, yeah, I want to be known, but I at least want an acknowledgement that you know it ahead of time. So when it hits the papers, I have more trust in your vendors than when it hits the papers that I have. Scrutiny, I'm looking to jump ship.
I know there's a lot of people in the audience who want to make comments. Are there any end users that want to jump up and say, no, I don't want to accept the risk? There was a bunch of hands back here. Anybody want to comment and say, from an end user perspective, I don't want you to tell everybody if you don't have a fix?
I would say that.
Well, go ahead.
There's a due diligence on the vendor side as well. If they don't have a reasonable, tangible way to deal with the problem, why exacerbate it? It's need to know.
Well, we've got one person in agreement and even more hands.
I think you could actually use borderline negligence to disclose
But do you think there should be a time frame around that? 9 months, 3 months, a week, what? I mean, I think there's, to disclose or not to disclose and give the vendor time to prepare and determine, can I fix it or can I fix it and what do I disclose? But should there not be a time frame around that? 9 months is an awful long, I could have a baby in 9 months, right? It's a long time to wait you can't, but I could. But that's a long time to, be working on something that is a huge situation.
Well, I think regardless of time, I think it can still, even if it's mainstream, give it 9 months, give it 12 months. Even if it's mainstream with the vulnerability in existence for that long, I still think with that kind of disclosure, it could still be negligent. Because if there's no solution and that information becomes mainstream without the vendor, we all understand that vendors are going to at least make some sort of a good faith effort to try and fix the problem. They'd be stupid if they didn't, because they lose their whole business on things like that.
It's either way, to disclose or not to disclose, it's going to come out, right? Someone's going to find out, whether it's from the vendor, from my mother, it's going to come out. So we need to think about not
mother's a
disclosing, but
researcher,
what we're going to
Pat?
say when we disclose and who's going to do the disclosing, because eventually it's going to have to be disclosed.
It's not necessarily going to come out.
Well,
There's plenty of stuff that's never been disclosed.
I don't know. Pam's mother's pretty lead.
I don't know. I mean, I think you also have to look at it from both sides on the negligence part, right? I mean, one of the things I think that's great about the natural tension between researchers and vendors is that it makes sure that vendors aren't too lax, and it makes sure
So
that
checks and
that,
balances.
that researchers aren't just blasting things out over the internet at willy-nilly, right? Because I think when you start talking and say, well, it's really hard to fix, I mean, what does that mean? Because I've worked with vendors where they say it's hard to fix, and really what they mean is it's hard to put out a patch. It's much easier if we wait till the next version, and that just happens to be Q107. Do you guys mind waiting? And it's hard to come back at that, right? It's what does hard mean? And I think that if there isn't that natural pull between the two forces, it gets very easy for vendors to say, well, we can wait because nobody knows about it. And that's just, it's natural. It's not, I don't think it's negligence necessarily on that side, but one could make a case just the same that you're saying that it is negligent to release the information, that it's negligent not to.
Bob?
Yeah, I think it depends on the type of vulnerability that's made. So, as an example, something really bad is out there, and Cisco, as an example, finds out, here's a real bad thing. In my mind, one approach would be, so let me approach my top 10 customers or customer advisory board and say, look, there's something bad out there. What does this mean to you? And panel over at the city group may say, well, this thing may have some wire transfer systems where Sky over here may have strong policies. And those are two distinctly different issues. So depending on how it impacts different organizations, Cisco may choose to do something quickly or slowly or help people work on it. So in my mind, if there's something that's really severe that impacts organizations, then it's going to be different.
I mean, I just point out that, asking the top 10 customers, is going to have the side effect of making numbers 11 through N really upset with us. And the other thing, maybe a little more seriously, is that I think most at least big vendors have enough of a sense of how, the range of ways their systems are being used by customers so that they have a reasonable idea of, sort of what the worst case is, even without that kind of feedback.
Yeah, part of the other part that we struggle with in order to address something like that is that, as many of you know, and part of the reason that we all want information is so that we can make a judgment call for ourselves on what to do. And unfortunately, what that would exacerbate is we would now, and I don't know many people that can really do this otherwise, we now have 10 customers that know ahead of everybody else in a way that even though they're intending only to give us advice, it would be very hard for them not to look at their own corporations, and quite possibly irresponsible of them not to look at their own corporations and start changing something, at which point it then places a preferential treatment in such a position that would probably undermine the trust of a number of our own.
And actually, this is
I know where you're going, Bob. Don't misinterpret.
Okay, and this
that.
is actually a good segue into one of the other questions we had, which was, what about preferred lists of early notifications for some customers versus other customers? And I'll let John start because I know that there are some circumstances where they do.
It was interesting because there was one of the discussions this morning was one of the panel members, and Michael, feel free and acknowledge that you said this, but he'll remain anonymous for the moment, he's run into situations in which, having worked with the vendor, and the vendor stated in no uncertain terms, we don't have preferential lists, that he then heard from, I think it was from a customer, that, hey, they knew about it. So in a sense, something in that closed loop didn't work, which was if there's no preferential treatment and somehow from the vendor information was given to a customer, then ostensibly that's a disconnect from policy. But here's my own personal position, and I'll reflect of Cisco's as well. I think preferential treatment circumstantially can be necessary, but it's exceedingly small. And I'll give one example just by rights. But in a more general statement, at Cisco's policy, we don't have preferential stratification of customers. And I'll give you an example that's probably the most important. My team, I sit sort of as a vendor, and I also sit as a practitioner, and I've also got history and research. My team cannot, even with my knowledge, upgrade our own network on undisclosed, unfixed, or recently or soon to be coming out flaws. So I can't protect my own company with information my company has any differently than you. And the reason I think that's important is because it treats me as a customer equally to any of our others. And the only exception to that is if the very infrastructure that you're going to get the upgrades from has to be protected, so if it goes down, you wouldn't be able to fix yourselves either. And that's that narrow exception list in which there are times, and by the way, they don't even know enough to fill this hand, that the network infrastructure of the internet or the network infrastructure in front of the software center that you all get our upgrades from would be at risk in a condition that it would be unavailable, at which point we do no good whatsoever other than to try and protect both of those, and that's the circumstance, and it's what we call critical notification. And again, that's such a rare circumstance that it so frequently doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And I'm not even opposed to a preferential list. Like to me, that's something that's up to the vendor to decide if it's appropriate, and it's up to the customers to decide if they feel that it's appropriate. If you want to do it, that's fine. I think though there's a distinction between there's the formal list and the informal list, and it's actually the informal list that I'm less comfortable with. Formal list, you have control over it, you've made a decision that these people need to know for this business reason, that's cool. And yes, to state what you said earlier, yes, I've run into that situation. We toyed with when do we let our paying customers know and when do we let the vendor know. And we used to do it, we'd give the vendor some lead time, 2 days, 4 days, whatever it was, and ultimately we went to a system whereby we let the vendor and our paying customers know at the same time because of that situation where we had issues where we would report it to the vendor, then we would report it to our customer, and they would come back and say, yeah, I already know about that, the vendor told me. Say, what? And it wasn't because it was the formal list,